Newscast.
Newscast from the BBC.
Hello, it's Laura in the studio.
I can see that. It's Paddy in the studio as well.
And
it's Nick Watt from Newsnight.
Welcome to you. Because after months and months and months and months of wrangling, which we've talked about lots of times, on Saturday evening, the US Congress finally passed a bill to send just over $61 billion of aid to Ukraine. Not clear when it will arrive, so you have to be careful of politicians dangling big price tags. But the package now goes to the Senate, where it's expected to pass before President Biden will sign it into law. Let's have a moment to listen and watch to what happened when it passed.
The bill is passed without objection. A motion to reconsider is laid on the table.
It's interesting, if you break the vote down, all of the House Democrats voted for the measure, and more Republicans voted against it than voted for it. And inevitably, it's a reminder of why it was held up, why it'll be a political issue still in this election year in the US. On Radio 4 this morning, we heard from Michael Clarke of the Defence think tank and also, expert advisor. And he compared this vote to Europe's great struggles for freedom in the past.
They have to stay in the war this year, and next year things may change in a more structural way. But this, for the Ukrainians, it's a bit like in the Second World War. This is the 1941 moment. There was nothing but defeat through 1940, 1941. The balance shifted for the Allies during 1941, but the effect wasn't felt until the autumn of 1942. The Battle of Alamein was the first time that the tide began to turn.
That's so interesting, isn't it, to put it into that kind of context, because those are the kinds of warnings we've had coming out of Ukraine, saying unless this happens, the tide is going to go the wrong way. We know that they've been struggling in recent months. And I remember talking to the First Lady of Ukraine saying, actually, look, our guys at the front are running out of shells. This is a practical, real problem right now. They've been saying that for months. Nick, how do you think our politicians here will feel about the US finally being able to move on this?
Well, they will be absolutely delighted because the UK's commitment to Ukraine across all the parties is an ironclad commitment. But unless you have that crucial support from the United States, you're going to struggle. It's interesting. I was talking some time ago to one of Rishi Sunak's closest allies, and I said, is the following scenario going to happen? In the year before the US presidential election, Donald Trump is just going to completely dominate the Republican field, and that will mean that Republicans in Congress will get nervous, and therefore there won't be the support for Ukraine. And this person very close to the Prime Minister said, no, that won't happen, because the so-called national security Republicans put them with the Democrats and all will be fine. Well, that's not what happened. It has been held up, but it appears fundamentally the reason why Speaker Johnson was able to get this over the line was, I think he went to Mar-a-Lago, he saw Donald Trump, and Donald Trump said, I agree with the dissenters, I agree with Marjorie Taylor Greene, but you're doing a good job, Speaker. So Donald Trump, not the president, but has been absolutely crucial to these calculations.
Also, isn't one of the things, will there be newscasters saying two nuclear superpowers funding a war in Europe? That's actually not something to cheer about. The destination really is a table with peace talks. But what I'm hearing from Michael Clarke is that that's a long, long way away.
But if the destination is peace talks and it was tomorrow, then Russia would have significant chunks of Ukraine and they would accept that. And then the concern is 5 or 6 years down the line, back we go, Russia go in again. Is the deep concern why there are deep, deep fears about having a peace settlement now.
But I suppose in a way, this vote last night does close down one episode in this ongoing conflict and how Western politicians are grappling with it, because that package has now been passed.
So we will move on because we have lots to get to on the Sunday roundup. But that vote happened, the reaction's coming in, and we now moves to the Senate where it's expected to pass.
So this morning, after we talked a lot about climate change yesterday with Chris Stark, who's the boss of the government's watchdog, the Climate Change Committee, he said very plainly, in his view, Rishi Sunak has set the UK back. He had a bit of telling off for all politicians, actually, for being sort of afraid to talk about climate change with the same vigour they did a couple of years ago. So we put to the Energy Secretary, Clarke Coutinho, this morning, this accusation, really, that actually the government is going in the wrong way. They are not on track to meet the 2030 climate target. But it was interesting this morning, She very clearly said that target was going to be met and it will stay.
We're not moving away from our targets. And I would just say, again, out of all of our targets, not only have we met, we've overshot. Whereas if you look at the Scottish Government, out of their last 12 targets, they missed 8 of them. So we have a very strong track record of delivery, but we are going to do this in a fair way. And let me just say, Laura, there are 2 ways of doing this. You can do this in a fair way, make sure that we're protecting households, or you can take, for example, the Labour approach, who the changes that they want to make, for example, shutting down the North Sea, industry have said that would leave the country uninvestable.
Well, it's interesting. A lot of people think actually the government is not credibly on track to hit that 2030 target. And whatever you think about climate change, all this really matters because by law, the country has to hit net zero by 2050. So it's a very sort of live area. And I do think, as you heard Claire Coutinho there, I do think that the Tories are going to really try and make this a big dividing line, to use that terrible jargon in the election. And I think the Labour Party is too. What do you think, Nick?
Yeah, so, I mean, as you heard from Claire Coutinho, the government's view, Rishi Sunak's view, is climate change is real. We have these targets and we want to meet these targets. But there has clearly been a watering down of some of the steps towards those targets. And I watched when that happened. It was the Uxbridge and South Ruislip by-election, not over a climate issue, it was over a pollution issue, which was extending the ultra-low emission zone to the outer London boroughs. Uxbridge being one of those boroughs. It was about to happen. It was an absolutely huge thing. I went there a month before the by-election, sitting on the beautiful Uxbridge cricket green, talking to people playing cricket on a beautiful midsummer's evening, and they said, there's no way we can vote Labour because you're going to make our lives difficult here by Sadiq Khan extending the ULEZ zone here. You don't understand our lives. And I went back to Westminster, said to Tory MPs, I think you can win that by-election. And they said, are you mad? There's no way we can. They won it and they went, hello.
Was it all down to you, Nick? Because you said, this is the way to do it.
No, hang on, because I also went to
I was just thinking that.
And, we had that on early editions of Newscast. I met a mobile oven service.
Man in a van.
Man in a van. He travels to your home, he cleans your oven. His van wasn't ULEZ compliant. He said, if Sadiq makes me pay, then I'm going to get out of the business. And inevitably, in riposte, the Westminster bubble people say this was just a matter of 600 or 800 votes. This was not kind of like a massive thing. But it was so against the odds, wasn't it? Because it was the Boris Johnson seat. It was a big moment.
And it was, you don't understand our lives.
Yeah.
Because the point about public transport to Uxbridge is if you have one rail line with 2 lines, Metropolitan Piccadilly, so you can get in and out of London, but to get around, you don't have the sort of public transport you have in Camden.
We're not going to have people in London complaining about not having much public transport when newscasters right around the country don't have tubes, don't have buses, don't have overgrounds, don't have all sorts of other things. This will not stand.
And you can get there on the Elizabeth line. There's another line.
You see, there's an embarrassment of choice in the capital.
And people who don't live in Greater London are furious. The ULEZ issue was what we call a hot button issue. And am I right? You two are the most, you're the boffins. It did. After that, Rishi Sunak diluted his plans.
Oh, yeah. It shifted their policy, no doubt, but it hasn't shifted the polls since then. So it is the case that the government has scaled back on some of the speed of its overall ambition on climate. There's no doubt about that. But it hasn't shifted the polls. So does it look like it was a genius idea at the time because of Uxbridge? It looked like that's a cunning bit of political fancy footwork. Possibly.
I think they were in complete shock that they had won this by-election because they were astonished and they thought, hello, here is a great, great opportunity. But as Laura says, fundamentally, it hasn't shifted the dial nationally.
What about Labour on climate? So they are promising clean energy by 2030, which, to a lot of people might sound like a good thing on the tin. Shabana Mahmood, their Shadow Justice Secretary, did admit this morning they'll still have to have reserves of gas, which they don't quite like saying so much. It doesn't quite fit in with the slogan. But the question to them has always been for the last couple of months for Labour is how do you pay for this big, expensive transition if they're no longer committed to the £28 billion? And also, given the giant size of the promises that they're making, how do you get there? Because it would be in the speed that they're claiming. This is what she said this morning.
We've had to recalibrate our plans given what is the likely economic inheritance that this government will leave for whoever is in the next government. So that we've had to do that. We obviously want to make sure that everything we put forward is credible. Fiscal responsibility is the absolute basis for all of our plans, and we have to make sure that any borrowing that occurs is within our own fiscal rules. So we have had to scale back, but that doesn't stop us from having an incredibly ambitious plan to get to clean power by 2030. We can do that within the commitments that we have made. We've laid out the detail of our spending plans there, what will come from the windfall tax, what will come from, recalibrated plans on borrowing, but some borrowing all the same, to make sure that we can have clean energy and be secure and get our bills down by 2030.
Can I just say that phrase, because of the economic inheritance, we're going to recalibrate our plans. I'm going to have to get very used to that, aren't I?
I think you are. I think you really, really are.
But when it's a U-turn. It's not a full U-turn because they're still committed to it, but they're not committed to the 28 billion from day one.
Well, they're committed to the promise, but not committed to the price tag that goes along with it. So if I say, well, I'd like to buy 10 bags of sweets and they're going to cost me £10, I can then say, well, I'm not going to spend £10, but I'd still like the 10 bags of sweets. You can see that the Tories are going to go after them again and again and again, because it allows them to say their favourite thing about the Labour Party, which is their sums don't add up and you can't trust them with your chequebook.
Like on that, Kathleen is asking that. What is the plan for Labour? How will they foot the bill to invest in renewable energy?
Well, should I just say there is a feeling in the Shadow Cabinet that they are monumentally right to have this plan to move to clean power by 2030, but they were monumentally wrong not to brand it as clean power by 2030, but to brand it on 28 billion a year from day one. A lot of feeling in the Shadow Cabinet that that is the fault of Ed Miliband, who is obviously profoundly committed to this, but comes from the Gordon Brown camp. And how did Gordon Brown define what he was doing when he was Chancellor? It was by a spending tag.
Billions.
We've moved on from that era. It's a much more difficult era. And the concern is that this is the right thing to do because obviously you want to have clean power. It's the right thing to do because what you're talking about is regenerating areas that have been left behind. What you're talking about is taking Joe Biden's plan, the Inflation Reduction Act, and putting it here. The mistake they believe they made was to define it around money, and that was fine 15 to 20 years ago, not fine now. And there's a worry that you have damaged what is a really, really good idea by labelling it in the wrong way. Well, big concerns in the Shadow Cabinet.
Yeah, and when you say damage, it just means being 3 times ahead in the polls of the government, 2.5 times. It's a really nuanced version of damage. Tony Blair's given a very interesting interview to the Sunday Times magazine to newscasters looking to pay for journalism today and go and buy.
That's a noble thing to do.
Well, and also he says a couple of things in there, including this point that you've just heard on your programme today. The economic inheritance that the next government's going to get is not being properly addressed, I don't think, in terms of just what does it look like on day one for Rachel Reeves or Jeremy Hunt.
And this is one of the huge unsaid things, is that the Conservatives don't want to talk at all in their campaign or their manifesto might come about the kind of squeeze that there could be to public budgets on the plan so far that they have laid out. And the Labour Party also absolutely does not want to talk about the kind of squeeze that there might be on budgets, because what does squeeze on public budgets mean? It means that you've got less money to spend on hospitals. It means you've got less money to spend on schools. And it also means if you want to do big snazzy reforms, which might save you more money in the long term, but they often, big snazzy reforms, cost some money in the short term, and there just ain't going to be very much of that around. So I think in a way, coming into the election, it's not going to be anything like a chequebook election of old when everybody's promising huge amounts of billions for this, that and the other. But there is also going to be, I think, something of maybe a conspiracy of silence. That might be too strong, but there is going to be a reluctance, a very distinct reluctance to spell out what the economic picture will actually mean in brass tacks, although Labour will, they already are, very happy to go around saying it's going to be the worst economic inheritance since World War II.
And marathon running Jeremy Hunt, they believe in the Labour Party, is not helping them on that because we are now not due to get a spending review until after the general election.
Yeah.
We don't have specific numbers on the tin for what happens from next April. So if Labour wins the election, you'll have a new chancellor who will have to outline those spending plans, which on the current plan will mean very, very serious cuts in unprotected areas, and they'll have to take the can for that. What I would say is that there are real nerves in the shadow cabinet at the moment about what happens after the election. So you talk to them and privately they say, of course we're going to win the election. Of course we're going to get a majority, but we're not saying that because we can't be complacent. And what they're worried about is not so much that they don't have the plans for how you govern. So there's Sue Gray, this former big beast from Whitehall, who's getting them ready. That's all fine. You meet your permanent secretaries. Here's how you implement your manifesto pledges. What they're worried about is that they're not ready enough politically for what they're going to do. Big concerns in some of the Rachel Reeves circle at the moment. What's going to be the theme of her chancellorship? It was going to be Bidenomics. Bidenomics was based on replicating his plans, the Inflation Reduction Act. That's taken a big hit. So they're really, really nervous that they're not prepared enough politically for that governance from day one.
It's this phrase, be careful what you wish for, brought into a political moment. Yesterday, on the Saturday edition, you promised us tittle-tattle about election timing, and you refused to give it to us.
I did, and I was going to keep that as a fun little thing at the end of the podcast, but I won't tease you anymore. I'll just tell you now, because we've come to talking about the general election. So I am not saying this is going to happen at all, but to add to the endless running fountain of election date speculation, there's been a lot of chat about early election. Will Rishi Sunak be forced into naming a date after the local elections if there is some kind of Tory Armageddon, or if things like Andy Street loses in Birmingham or Ben Houchen, the mayor in Teesside, loses too? However, it was suggested to me this week that there was a potential, even more cunning plan to try to avoid the jangling horror of a post-local election challenge to Rishi Sunak. Could he actually call the general election before the local elections? So might he call the general election at the end of April, have the general election in June, and therefore avoid a post-local election Armageddon and a challenge to his leadership? Because by that point, MPs will be all scurrying around trying to hold on to their seats.
Well, Laura, that is potentially very clever. And there's a very significant constitutional point there. Now that we're talking about the Constitution, we have to sound extremely pompous.
Yeah. I find very easy to do that.
Yes, you have to be very, very pompous when you're talking about the Constitution. But calling the election is technically a power for the monarch.
Indeed.
And the Prime Minister has to request the monarch to dissolve Parliament.
Indeed.
And the monarch is always happy to do that, assuming you are a fully functioning Prime Minister. What is the definition of a fully functioning Prime Minister?
Well, how long have you got?
You command the confidence of the House of Commons, which means at the moment that you command the confidence of the Conservative Party. If there's any question, i.e. there's a challenge to Rishi Sunak, that he doesn't command the confidence of his party, and therefore he doesn't command the confidence of the Commons, the monarch may have to pause, or the golden triangle, as it's known, that have the discussions before the Prime Minister makes that sort of request. They need to pause if there's any question mark about whether he's a fully functioning Prime Minister.
And the argument that was put to me of somebody who believes that they ought to take this tack. And to be clear, newscasters, I am not saying this is what is going to happen. We are in the business of scenario understanding and talking to people about potential scenarios. Yeah, but this is, this has been put to me, and I think it is of worth to put it out there amongst all the other election speculation. And a summer election is a possibility that is being discussed, right? We can be clear with newscasters, that is being discussed in serious political circles.
Two things.
And a cabinet minister said to me, yes, it's not the most likely option, but it is a possible option. But the point about going early and calling in April would basically be Rishi Sunak using what's one of the last things left to him, which is the power of surprise. Although it might not be that surprising now, we've been talking about it today.
No, it is surprising.
But he's basically banjaxed by everything else, right? And nothing else seems to be moving for him. Nothing else seems to be helping. So actually, if he could stun everybody, not just going early, but going even earlier than the idea of being early, then that might help him regain the agenda.
So he has implied the opposite. And also, isn't there also a case for going long? That remains the case anyway. Because
you're a January man, aren't you, Paddy?
I have said, why not January? But, I mean, no one's going to take what I'm saying seriously on this. I hope they don't. But it's totally new thinking that Laura's making me do. And you too.
I mean, I was talking to one of his close friends the other day who is an absolute advocate for going as late as possible. And we were talking about this potential summer election. And this person said, right, got to go and see Rishi and tell him that's not a good idea. And their thinking was the original Rishi Sunak thinking, which is inflation is heading in one direction, down. Interest rates falling is much bigger than relatively modest tax cuts. So go late. Obviously, the problem with that is they had assumed in Downing Street that we would start to be seeing the beginnings of those interest rates cuts in May. That's clearly not going to happen because of persistent inflation in the United States, which doesn't seem to be damaging them, but is having a knock-on effect on us. And we may not see interest rates going down till September, which then lends the argument, the credence to the potential Laura scenario of just getting on with it.
And the other thing about this is as well is I think in sort of Tory HQ, the feeling used to be, well, things can't really get worse. Well, then they did. And then they did again. And then they did again. And whether it's, William Ragg pops up one week, Mark Menzies pops up the next week, you've got a by-election in another week. Just the feeling was that the economy will improve, things will get better. And maybe that will come to pass. Maybe someone said to me the other day, people will be cheerier. They might have been able to afford their first holiday in a while. They'll come back in September in a better mood. Maybe England will do well in the football. All of these things matter to the kind of national mood. But I think the theory that things couldn't get worse has sort of been tested to destruction. And, who knows?
So a significant Tory said to me, the key signal to look out for on the election timing is when does Conservative Central Office impose by-election rules for the selection of candidates? So when you impose by-election rules, that means basically Conservative Central Office has massive power over the selection of candidates, which normally they don't have. That's what you've got to look out for.
So we can triangulate the Laura scenario by the by-election rules. If we see an early by-election move, then we say Laura Kuenssberg is stronger.
But it's even worse than that because it's by-elections it's Tory HQ imposing different by-election rules on for the selection of candidates. It's not by-elections for like normal people.
No,
it's a different thing. It's basically when the central party can go, right, sorry, local people, we're not going to consult you. We're just going to put our favourite people into this pot, this pot, this pot.
Your election tittle-tattle was definitely worth waiting 24 hours for.
Well, I'm glad.
So, election tittle-tattle, a very well-researched piece of intelligence from a very distinguished political journalist speaking to leading members of the governing party. We have to stand together, us political hacks.
You have.
We've got to look after each other.
I feel educated just looking at the two of you, let alone listening to you.
Oh, aren't you lucky?
Now, look, we're going to move round the news dial because the time will defeat us if we don't get to the giant Met mess.
Yes, the giant Met mess. Well, we spoke about this yesterday, and I'm very glad that we talked about this yesterday, not just because it's important, but because actually as a story it's been building some significance. And if you didn't hear yesterday's episode and you haven't watched the news or read the papers this morning, a Jewish man, Gideon Falter, was told by a member of the Metropolitan Police when he was passing a pro-Palestinian demonstration that he was openly Jewish, which for reasons you don't need me to explain is something that many people took offence at, not the kind of thing a policeman should be saying to a member of the public, and suggested that he moved on from the demonstration. Fast forward 24 hours, former Home Secretary Suella Braverman is calling for the Met boss to go, and there is a lot of political discussion about what should happen. The Home Secretary, James Cleverly, has written to the Metropolitan Police Commissioner. I understand they'll have a meeting to discuss what happened in the coming days. So I was asking this morning, Clarke Coutinho, Cabinet Minister, should Mark Rowley have to go?
Those are questions for the Home Secretary. I know that he will be meeting with ministers in coming days, but the really important thing is that we get policing right. So if you look at what's happened in this incident, a member of the public has been told that they can't go about their daily life, walk around the streets of London because of their identity. That is not what equality means in society.
And because of that, do you, though, as a Cabinet Minister, believe that Mark Rowley should lose his job?
So I personally wouldn't go that far because I haven't had the conversations with him. I don't understand, yet what he's going to say to the Home Secretary. Those conversations need to take place. But I think it is really important that we stand by the Jewish community and other communities as well and say that we will not stand for this. That is not what equality means in society today.
Right, so two things. The Met has re-apologised, but since she spoke to you, Gideon Falter, the man at the centre of this, has been speaking on camera and on the radio to broadcasters, including the BBC, after your show. And here's what he said.
I think it's time for Sir Mark Rowley to go. He's had long enough to get to grips with this situation, to get his police force under control, to tell his frontline officers, don't worry, we're going to send enough police to back you up so that you can make the right decisions. And instead he hasn't done that. And because of that, he has to go. The time has come.
So let me just give more of what the Met has said. That use of the term openly Jewish by one of our officers is hugely regrettable. We know it will have caused offence to many. We reiterate our apology. We have reflected on the strength of the response to our previous statement. In an effort to make a point about the policing of protest, we caused further offence. This was never our intention. We have removed that statement and we apologise. Being Jewish is not a provocation. Jewish Londoners must be able to feel safe in this city.
I mean, the combination of the Met and politics gets very, very messy very, very quickly. But it is, I think, to many newscasters, staggering that the Met continues to find itself getting into all sorts of things. Anyway, I think we need to draw to a close. We've talked about so many things. Nick, it's lovely to have had you with us today. Come back another time, especially after you've been so polite.
So we say to you, watching, listening and getting to the end of this, thank you and goodbye.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Newscast from the BBC.